This is not just about killing Black people and destroying their homes and businesses. This is about, removing Black people, expelling Black people. An intentional, deliberate, planned assault on a community. There are very few communities like Greenwood in the country at the time. There were 4 Black millionaires, right, in the Greenwood district in 1921. When you begin to move outward and understand that there were nearly 200 Black-owned businesses in the Greenwood district. And so you can begin to see and understand how Greenwood was a symbol of what was possible. What was happening in the Greenwood district wouldn't be contained within the Greenwood district. These same individuals would be pressing for greater inclusion, political and civil rights. 1917, America enters World War I. There's a huge war mobilization that includes Black men. And part of the reason why Black people enthusiastically join the war effort is there's this belief that if Black people show their patriotism, might be enough to create goodwill or perhaps even lead to the eradication of Jim Crow segregation and other barriers to Black life. And so whites who have ears and can feel this energy bubbling up, they are resistant to this happening. They saw them as trying to change America, change Tulsa to something that they did not agree with. Prior to the race massacre, there were at least a dozen attacks on Black people and Black communities in other parts of the country that occurred beginning in 1918. And oftentimes Black people were blamed for the violence that was inflicted upon them. There was tremendous angst around lynching occurring again in Tulsa. And there had been 2 lynchings, one in Tulsa, one in Oklahoma City. And so there was tremendous outrage in the Black community. And A.J. Smitherin, who was the editor of the Tulsa Star, spoke out against both lynchings and really, chastised Oklahoma as well as the Black community to never let a lynching of another person, particularly a Black person, occur again. And so what drives particularly Black men downtown Tulsa on the evening of May 31st, 1921, were the editorials around trying to prevent the lynching of another person, and particularly a Black person. The elevator incident is thought of as the key moment that precipitates a race massacre. Now, we want to be clear that it wasn't the cause. Sarah Page, a young white girl, we believe she was about 17 years old, and Dick Rowland, who we believe was about 19 years old. These individuals came into contact with each other in an elevator in the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa in the early morning hours of May 30th. The elevator may have jostled as Dick Rowland attempts to enter. He trips and he bumps into, or he grabs, Sarah Page. She runs from the elevator in a panic. Dick Rowland runs the other way. That sets off rumors of a rape. That sets off the white community to try to seek vengeance for what occurred. The other theory is that Dick Rowland and Sarah Page had been romantically involved. Perhaps Dick Rowland wanted to end it. Perhaps she wanted to end it, and she runs out. And given interracial marriage was banned, for Sarah Page, at minimum, a kind of shunning and shaming by whites. And for Dick Rowland, it could have led to racial violence. And so with the very public way in which she fled the elevator and other people heard her, some surmised that she told the story to police officers about being attacked by Dick Rowland to sort of hide the relationship. After the elevator incident, she was arrested. As news of what occurred is spreading, and then with the publication of the newspaper article, and the question becomes, what are we going to do? And those murmurs ultimately lead to white Tulsans, by the evening hours, amassing to, lynch Dick Rowland. And calls for handing him over to them began around, 8:30, 9 o'clock. When rumors of the lynching begins to come to the attention of A.J. Smitherman, meetings are organized to figure out how are we going to respond. Ultimately, two groups of Black men go downtown armed to offer assistance to the authorities, to say that we as members of this community are not going to allow a mob to lynch a man before he has received a trial. So you have a group of Black men who are going downtown, some of which are veterans, and then you have whites who are coming downtown enraged, incensed of a rape. And so you had a coalescing of a number of factors. The second group of Black men who come downtown, one of the white men in the crowd attempt to disarm them. And in attempting to disarm them, there's a melee that occurs. And in that fracas, a shot is fired. It's a white bystander. Within minutes, this is an all-out gunfight. Black men who come downtown recognize that they are outnumbered, try to make their way back to the Greenwood district. Whites are in pursuit. And so Black men recognize that during the evening hours and the early morning hours, they were able to block the mob from invading the community. But by 5 a.m. on June 1, whites had not only amassed on the southern border, but also along the western border of the community. And not just several hundred whites, we believe there were thousands of whites. We believe between 250 and 500 white civilians, right, are deputized and told to arrest, detain, and kill, if necessary, Black people who were, quote unquote, in rebellion. Around 5, what sounded like a whistle blew. And that was a signal to invade the community. The Tulsa Police, Sheriff Department, as well as National Guard participated in this and began to shoot and kill Black people who offered any kind of resistance, or Black people who were fleeing the violence. There were airplanes. They were dropping explosives, some sort of incendiary bomb. There's also recollections of machine gun fire, from multiple places, firing on the community. And in addition to that, whites are going from house to house, searching for Black men or Black people who are armed, who are offering resistance. And what you saw from 5 a.m. to 11 a.m. was literally the total near destruction of a 35-block area that had been home to one of the wealthiest Black communities in the country. After the dust settled and the smoke cleared, white voices in the city began to blame black people for what occurred, and then also at the same time began to say, well, this is an opportunity for us to transform the Greenwood district into a train depot. This wasn't just a massacre. This was an attempted expulsion of the community. And had it not been for one survivor saying, we will not take a pittance for our property, Rather than try to pay them for their land, they tried to block them from their land. The intent was to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for Black survivors to rebuild. And not being able to rebuild, they would be forced then to sell their property to the city at a pittance. When you combine sort of this sentiment with what city leadership did days after to try to prevent the rebuilding, the city leadership, as well as white Tulsans, were very clear that they did not want Black Wall Street, the Greenwood District, to be rebuilt. And save for the efforts of B.C. Franklin, the East End Welfare Committee, and just the grit and courageousness of Black survivors, there would be no Greenwood today. 100 years later, no survivor, no descendant has received any restitution from the city or the state of Oklahoma. The only individuals who've received restitution for the violence and destruction that occurred were white business owners whose gun stores were looted by whites who were clamoring to get their hands on a weapon to go into the Greenwood District. And that's something that is deeply felt by the community. And there is a deep-seated belief that the community cannot move forward if reparations and restitution aren't extended. We really need to talk about what occurred as a massacre. And when I say massacre, what I am talking about is a systematic and intentional assault on a civilian community. This is not just about killing Black people and destroying their homes and businesses. This is about, removing Black people, expelling Black people from Tulsa. The origins of Black people in Oklahoma really revolves around slavery. For Oklahoma, the draw was the available land. We believe about 3,000 enslaved Blacks came to Oklahoma with indigenous people as their slaves beginning in the 1830s. Slavery in Indian territory or in Oklahoma was similar to slavery in other parts of the country in the sense that Black Americans, Black people were the property of a slaveholder or a slave owner. Once slavery was formally abolished in 1865, Black people in Oklahoma received something, or at least the promise of something that enslaved people in other parts of the country, particularly the South, did not receive, and that was a promise of land ownership. The federal government forced the Native nations to not only provide land allotments, but they also required them to extend political rights, civil liberties to them. Black people, after gaining their freedom, could perhaps own land and gain citizenship within tribal nations. And so in Oklahoma, post-slavery, Black people had a different reality. They had a basis for economic independence, for political and economic rights based on the treaties that the federal government forced tribal nations to sign. That created a new reality for Black Oklahomans. And so because of those land allotments, it created the basis for what would become the 50 all-Black towns. Most of those all-Black towns were in eastern Oklahoma. That was sort of the main sort of areas in which tribal nations held land. The presence of all-Black towns became kind of a beacon for Black people in the Deep South because of the prospect of land ownership. And the reason why Black people are attracted to Oklahoma is not just the prospect of land, but it's also the presence of Black boosters, an individual or entities that are trying to encourage migration to a place. Essentially, what boosters try to do is to paint a picture of what your life like is where you are and how it could be better. We have to just really understand land is the way in which the cycle of poverty was broken in America, whether you were Black or white. And so land was so important. The idea of Oklahoma as a place where Black people could, particularly who were fleeing the South, could reestablish themselves and go from, penniless sharecroppers to landowners. In 1906, O.W. Gurley, who's considered to be one of the founders of Black Wall Street, purchased a swath of land that would become the basis upon the Greenwood neighborhood, the Greenwood district. What we know in terms of the 1910 census, there were roughly about 1,000 Black people in Tulsa. By 1921, there are over 11,000 Black people. So they would have properties that were connected to each other, and connecting multiple properties together, they could begin to build an all-Black town. They could begin to build, a community. Tulsa is a boom town built on oil and oil wealth. And the prospect of oil wealth attracted Black people as well as whites. And so Tulsa had, as a whole, maybe a couple thousand people, right, in 1905. By 1921, there's roughly 100,000 people, right, in Tulsa proper. The groups that had been in Tulsa get dwarfed by the incoming migration of Black Americans from the South, as well as white Southerners who are coming to Tulsa in search of land, in search of wealth, to build that better life that we talked about.
So what's known as Black Wall Street is the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's the African American community in Tulsa. It abuts downtown Tulsa, separated by the Frisco tracks. It's a roughly 35 square block area. The first person to establish a business in the Greenwood community was a fellow named O.W. Gurley, who was a relatively wealthy Black businessman from Arkansas. He wound up in Tulsa, bought a parcel of land, built a grocery store and a rooming house, and businesses just proliferated after that. Black folks were not able to engage with the dominant mainstream economy in downtown Tulsa. So they had to create opportunities for themselves to ply their trades and to buy services and goods. The dollars circulated within the confines of the community, and it really helped build up the financial foundation of the community. It's called Black Wall Street, but it's really much more like a Black Main Street, in that these were mostly small businesses, mom and pop type operations. It was a community in which Black people could be their true selves, could operate successfully on the economic plane, but also socially and politically as well in the context of the community. The moniker, the Negro Wall Street of America, comes from Booker T. Washington, who visited the area several times. W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous intellectual, visited here. Walter White, the famous executive with the NAACP, visited here as well. So the community was renowned for its concentration of Black economic prowess and entrepreneurship. Simultaneously, Tulsa was renowned because it was growing rapidly, becoming the self-described oil capital of the world, to engines creating a lot of buzz around the nation generally. One of the things that happened after the massacre was a commitment on the part of Black Tulsans to rebuild the community. They faced a lot of barriers to the rebuilding, but in spite of all that, they rebounded and they rebuilt. That really is the essence of the human spirit. It's about resilience and perseverance, and I think there's music that comes out of oppression that is memorable, historical, unforgettable. I think about the Gap Band, prominent mostly in the 80s. GAP stands for Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, 3 streets in the Greenwood district. So that's remarkable. The realities on the ground today are much different because the world is different. Society has changed. We have integration. We've had urban renewal. So the community is substantially different from what it was, say, in 1920, just before the massacre, or even when it peaked in the early to mid 1940s, which is something people don't understand. The community was destroyed in 1921, rebuilt to a greater degree, to higher heights in the early to mid 1940s. And today, what we have is an integrated community that really is an amalgam of different kinds of interests: residential, commercial, educational, entertainment, and on and on and on. So it's a community sort of in search of a new identity, a new iteration of Black Wall Street. So I think there is something about this community, and I think there is something that we can leverage. All of us who are in the community today can leverage to be better people. That's absolutely the case. It's really about choice, about how we choose to approach the history.